This is the Danger Close podcast, Beyond the Books with me, Jack Carr. Welcome to the Danger Close podcast, an Ironclad original presented by Navy Federal Credit Union. Before we get started, just a quick reminder that In the Blood, the next novel in the James Reese saga, is coming in hot on May 17th in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook, and is available for pre-order now. My guest today, Ric Prado. He's a legend in intelligence circles. It was such an honor to talk to him. He had an incredible career at the Central Intelligence Agency and is just an amazing individual. His book, Black Ops, is out now. Be sure to go to Ric Prado, that's PRADO.com, to find out more about him. And I cannot recommend this book enough, you'll find out why in the podcast. So now, without further ado, Ric Prado. Oh my gosh, what a ride you have had. And what an amazing example you are to this next generation of people that want to serve their country. I mean, there's so much to go over with you. I don't even know where to start. But your upbringing is, it's incredible that you were born in Cuba. You saw the effects of Castro's regime and the revolution and made it to this country, and then go into this life of service and have touch points with these legends in special operations and intelligence circles. And you probably won't say it yourself, but become a legend yourself as you go through this process on this journey. So, incredible. And I'm going to let you say something here too, because I know I'm just blabbing on here, but this is the book that I would have loved to have read this book 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, high school, because books like this are going to inspire the next generation. Just like some of those books that you read growing up inspired you. You're now paying that forward, and a whole nother generation is going to enter intelligence circles because they're inspired by the things that you did. And I think it's just remarkable.
Thank you very much. I think that's a great start, because the purpose of the book actually came out from my frustration that my agency is the most maligned, worst represented by Hollywood primarily. And the fact that we have this secrecy that goes from the quiet professionals, but they take it to the extreme. So we don't capitalize on putting the word out of the things that we can. And the book is a perfect example. The book was cleared by the agency. So everything in there was authorized. You read it, you see that there's a lot of examples. There's some things that were taken out. But for the average American, best case scenario, the CIA is this pit bull you keep in the backyard, throw them a bone once in a while and let them kill whatever gets into your yard. And nothing could be further from the truth. Jason Bourne does not represent my clique. American Made definitely doesn't. Even some of the more benign, a lot of people say 3 Days of a Condor was a great movie. I said it was, but it also depicts the agency in a very negative, eat your own kind of thing. So when I was confronted by primarily Cofer Black, who was my boss and then my partner in Blackwater, we talked about it incessantly. You need to tell your story, because your story can carry so many things in the sense of being a hyphenated American, even though we don't hyphenate anything in my family. We're Americans. So it just goes on and on. The amount of support has been humbling. But the goal for me from the very beginning has been to honor those people in the agency that have sacrificed so much. Divorces and family issues and sacrifices and separations. And we have 137 stars on our wall. We are a very small organization. We're not Army, Navy, Air Force, or Marines. And our director of operations is even smaller. And 137, and a third of those are post 9/11. And some of those I knew personally. So for me, I besides having a debt of honor to this country, which is why I started what I started doing, at age 20, I also felt that my colleagues, especially those who were sacrificed the most, deserves their grandchildren to be able to pick up that book and say, oh, wow. So that's what they really did.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to read a couple things from it here, but this is the first thing that I got to that I highlighted, and it's so it's so well written and so cool. You say there's a war that goes on in broad daylight in the everyday streets of cities around the world. It has its own rules, its own foot soldiers and leaders, and it is invisible to those simply wanting to live their lives in peace. Like a universal police officer walking the local beat of international crime and intrigue, you'll never look at everyday American life the same. You'll see the danger lurks from seemingly innocuous sources. You'll find Hezbollah sleeper cells in your own town, North Korean agents sneaking across our borders, terrorists lurking and lying in wait. It is thankless, anonymous task stopping these forces. But my colleagues do so not for accolades and fame. They seek only to preserve the lives of strangers in the nation they love. That's pretty cool. It is moving, and I think it really captures what those who are drawn to a life of service do it for people they'll never know, for a way of life. Um, and I love how you talk about in this book uh, your upbringing in Cuba, because you a lot of us in this country are so comfortable, and we have the luxury of not having those experiences that would make us appreciate the freedoms, options, and opportunities that people like you sacrifice so much for. That generations from the inception of this country up until today sacrificed everything for. But you have that tangible touch point with a dictatorship from which you and your family had to flee. And I wanted to ask you about your first firefight at age 7.
Well, yeah, I was born in Cuba in 1951, and the revolution started around 56, 57. Castro's in the mountains. The mountain range nearest my town was where Che Guevara was held up with his guys. So my town was the first. It was a good sized town. It was a cattle town. My dad was a cowboy. They would come down and they do raids on the bars that the military or the police would frequent. And one of those nights, I was watching TV with a nanny because my parents had gone out to dinner, and we hear commotion outside. A couple of shots, random, but nothing yet. But I knew that there was something going on. So, typical 7-year-old kid, curious. I run up to the window, and I crank the window open. It's those jealousy windows, and now I'm hearing even more gunshots. Well, what I didn't realize was that below the parapet of that window was a guerrilla fighter with a fully automatic weapon. And he let off 2 blasts of that stuff. And I was frozen, partially with surprise, but also there was a certain exhilaration about what was going on. And then, of course, my nanny grabbed me by the neck and took me away and made me swear that I would never tell my parents, and I didn't for 50 years. But so, as impactful as that was, because there were bodies and there was blood and all this other stuff, what really started settling in my brain was when I saw Castro take over. Shortly thereafter, I mean, not even 6 months after his tenure, began the confiscation of private property, the forcing of the schools to teach his methodology and his ideology, wearing uniforms to school. They had the different segments of ages and all this kind of stuff, and then I started seeing the oppression, the abuses, and I will remember till the day that I die. We had gone up to Havana, and I was probably nine and a half, about 9.5, and we were going to Havana, and as we turned into this park, there were men hanging from trees and lampposts with signs around them that said "Contra-revolutionaries." And of course, my poor mom, who was riding shotgun, jumped in the back of the seat trying to cover my eyes. Don't look, don't look. That was a little late. That's tattooed in my brain also. So that, and then the departure. I mean, as you mentioned, I'm an only child, and my parents, for nothing else than love for freedom, especially my dad. My mom was following my dad's leadership. She was, she believed it, but she had a little bit more pain executing. he did not want his son to grow up in a communist country. And imagine you taking your 10-year-old son, your only child, and putting him on a plane to go to a country that you've never been and may never even visit for freedom. When Castro took over, my dad had a 57 Pontiac. We had a TV and we had a phone in our house. We were solid middle class. And he was willing to give all that up and go into poverty as we started in the States for freedom. And you can imagine what kind of lesson that is for a 10-year-old. I turned 11 at an orphanage in Pueblo, Colorado. You think Pueblo, Colorado is a blue-collar town now. You should have seen it in 62. But he never regretted. And in the day he came to this country, that we were able to get reunited, he never took a welfare check. He always had 2 jobs. My mom worked the sweatshop. And he told us, we will be residents as soon as possible. We will be citizens of this country as soon as possible. And we ain't going anywhere. So that's kind of like the forging of my mettle. You know, when you have that kind of beginning and that kind of parents and those kind of examples, I am very proud that God gave me this path and that I had the fortitude to follow it, because there is a price to admission to what we do, you know?
Oh yeah. And, I studied a little bit, mostly the insurgency and Che Guevara and on that sort of thing. When I look at Cuba and Bay of Pigs, and I look at it through a standpoint of special operations and that sort of a lens, but I hadn't read about the Castro youth before I read your book. I don't know why I missed that in my reading up to this point, but what was the Castro youth?
Well, he immediately started militarizing everything. The first thing that actually happened was he designated in every neighborhood. We say neighborhood watch now is to keep an eye out on the thieves. Neighborhood watch in Cuba was every block had a person that would report what you said, when you came in, and they took shifts and they had to serve it that way. So, that in itself was a big step into that militarization. And then what he did was with the schools, all the kids have to wear these particular uniforms. Imagine I'm 9 years old and I am having to teach how to read to farmers in the outskirts of my town. How does an 8-year-old try to teach? The absurdity of that still, resonates in my brain. I'm going like, how does that make any sense? But it was part of that indoctrination, that, bringing them into a completely different world. The concept of ratting out your parents if they said something that was counter-revolutionary. That's what they inculcated in these schools and in these youth clubs. So it was very drastic change from the family nucleus to the explosion of the family and even families reporting on each other, much less neighbors.
I was going to ask you this later, if it was appropriate, but because you bring it up now, what have you noticed over the last 20 years, 25 years, particularly maybe the last 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, about this country and it getting comfortable with some of those things that you saw in your family saw in Cuba, but seeing that in this country as progress? What do you feel about that, or do you notice that? I'm sure you do.
Absolutely. and it scares the living daylights out of me because, you hit on something very astute a little while ago that I've echoed several times. We don't know how good we have it in this country. I had a lady that I was talking to a couple of months ago, and I mentioned that, and she says, well, I've been to Mexico. I said, no, ma'am, you were in Cancun on a cruise. There's a difference between going to Mexico and living in Guadalajara than you going on a cruise to one of the tourist sites. And that is, it's a blessing. It is a blessing that we're so comfortable that our states are the size of other countries. We have this homogeneous, continent that we are buffered by oceans and we're just spoiled. But when people travel and live overseas, or like in my case, in my parents' case, because, everybody feels sorry for Ric. Ric is the luckiest guy in the world. I am the luckiest man in the world. I came to the best country in the world, and served it and still trying to serve it, that try to pay back that debt of honor. But you know who paid the price? My mom and dad. They were never the same, especially my mom, because it was a very traumatic period. So I see these trends of socialism, utopia, and let's give everybody, socialism, and I've said this before, socialism is the mask that communism wears to lure you into his lair. There is no difference between socialism and it becoming communism. And it's totalitarian, is complete control. And one thing that they do say that is true is that everybody's going to be equally be miserable, with the exception of the leadership. Mm-hmm. There's a joke in Cuba that if you see a house that has been painted in the last 50 years, that's a senior party member.
Yeah. That's why I think this is so important for Americans to read right now, particularly those that are in that formative stage in their lives where they're so impressionable, to have an appreciation for what we have. Because without books like this, without people like you talking about this and these stories, they just go to the next game on their smartphone or their TikTok video or whatever it is. And meanwhile, we're headed down that path to giving up these freedoms that so many people died for. And I mean, you write about it here in such a powerful way. You say that in school, our teachers told us to watch each other and our families. If we heard anyone saying anything against Castro, we were to report it at once. The new regime weaponized us against our own families in perfect 1984-esque fashion. Around town, every block had a designated official who recorded his neighbor's movements. Ears were always open, listening to the slightest critique of Castro, his revolution, or of Marxism in general. Once reported, those people vanished, taken in the night by the stormtroopers of the 26th of July movement. As a Marxist indoctrination soon dominated every aspect of our lives in school, life back home became a growing nightmare for the middle class. A lot of people in the town had always been jealous of my family's success. We'd endured threats before, but this seemed different. Various revolutionary committees were formed, led by some of the true dregs of our city. Now that they had achieved a level of power they hadn't under a capitalist system, they took revenge on those more successful. Yeah.
Can you imagine that when in Cuba, by the way, my wife is Cuban. She went through the same thing. She's younger and she left later. She came out in I don't know, 68 or something like that, 69. But when you registered yourself for a passport, the Communist Party would show up at your house and inventory every single household item, glasses, silver spurs that my dad had, whatever it was. And when you got on that plane, before you got on that plane to leave Cuba, they would do that inventory again. And if there was anything missing, you could not leave. And it was all corruption. They were divvying up the prizes. And that was one of the reasons my dad could get out, because he had a 57 Pontiac that more than one general or captain or whatever the heck they were, wanted or lusted after. So it is, there's no hiding what communism is. And the fact that socialism is just a lure.
And I love that you talk about this, because this struck me as well. And I hadn't thought about it before, hadn't read it anywhere else before. And it's you looking back, retrospectively on what would have happened maybe had you stayed there another month, another year, another 2 years. You say your school had been tasked with selecting several of its most promising students to be sent to the Soviet Union for further education. My name was on that list. This would not have been optional. The government would simply put me on a plane to the Soviet Union, whether my parents agreed or not. In the years since, I've often wondered what would have happened to me if we had not received the tip. That's something else, the tip that told you to get out of there. Would I have ended up a Marxist too? Would I have joined an intelligence service like Cuba's version of the KGB? I'd like to think not, but the indoctrination those children were subjected to in the Soviet Union transformed most of them into revolutionary Marxists who later held positions of importance in the regime. I mean, wow, you were close to being put on a plane to the Soviet Union for further education.
Yeah, the Prado luck holds out. My uncle was my godmother's husband, who was my uncle. He was a socialist. He was a communist, let's put it that way. But blood is a little thicker than other things. And he felt compelled to tell my dad that my name was on that list. So that was what precipitated me leaving even earlier, even though they couldn't get out. So,
I mean, it's incredible. The whole story is fascinating, and you're not even 11 yet. You're not even 10 yet, and this is just the first opening chapter of the book. Bay of Pigs. Were you aware of what was going on at that young age, or what?
Yeah, it was national news. I was in Cuba for the Bay of Pigs, and I knew the area fairly well because we used to go to a beach near there when we couldn't go to Varadero because it was a little further. And so I knew where Bay of Pigs was, and I also knew that this was happening, but not that it was. I mean, it wasn't that obvious to me. I know the fights were all going on there. We could hear the planes, we could hear the radio. But these are all back to back cases where, it pushed my dad into, I got to get him out.
Wow. And looking back on that, having studied it now as an adult, what are your thoughts on Bay of Pigs and the political situation at the time? And how do you look at that event? Because it is such a seminal event, both in intelligence circles and then for you personally, having been born in Cuba.
Yeah, so definitely affected by both ends. The Bay of Pigs was the typical example of what not to do with an intelligence agency, and we're living through it again. And I know you've read some of this in there. The worst thing that you could do is politicize special operations, covert operations. Those have to be separate from political, ambitions or whatever. The original plan for the Bay of Pigs attack wasn't in Bay of Pigs. It was just south of Cienfuegos, which was a town a little further. It was about almost straight south of where I lived, but on the water side. And the reason that they had picked that, because again, the Escambray Mountains were there. The central highway went right through that town. And also the major railroad junction. So they felt that if they landed there, and it was a port, if they landed there in force, they could easily take the town over. The air support that Castro enjoyed was going to be neutralized, and some of it did, but by brave Cubans, not by anybody else coming as promised. But that became politically unpalatable because they wanted to make it look like it was insurrection, not an invasion. So they moved it to a mangrove, and that's where we dumped our people at. I've had the honor of meet and work with several real prominent guys who were there that time. One of them, a very good friend of mine named Amado, I won't go into last name. He was 18 years old when he landed in the Bay of Pigs. He was captured. He was traded for medicines. He went on to become a Army officer, Green Beret in Vietnam. Came out, went to Georgetown, got his advanced degrees, and joined CIA and retired as a senior operations officer. Wow. Now, you talk about people to look up to. That's humbling.
Wow, incredible! You've crossed paths with some quite a few characters over the years, quite a few legends over the years. But hey, your story starts out. Was it called the Peter Pan program that took people out of Cuba
yes.
and got them to the United States, and then got them to orphanages while they waited for their families that may or may not ever show up?
Yeah, the Peter Pan program was initially started to try to get the children of the opposition out so they would remain and felt that the kids were safe, and then try to do a political. But as the control was exacerbated by the events, that became a moot point. And then when the Bay of Pigs happened, it opened up to any kid that wanted to leave. And I think a little over 4,000 kids were taken out and put in different foster homes or different camps. There were 3 camps in South Florida designated as those. I don't know if you want to call it the short straw or whatever, but I drew the orphanage. And I don't regret it. I love horses, and that's the only thing I could go over there was rodeos. So, but it was a culture shock because that orphanage was very mixed. We had 3 or 4 different ethnic, groups in there, cultural groups in there, and turning 11 there was no picnic. There was no picnic.
I bet. Did you always have hope that you would see your family again, or did you know, hey, my parents are coming for me, and you never gave up that hope?
No, absolutely. And look, my dad was a very simple man. My dad had a seventh grade education, but he was a great businessman, and he was a very strong-willed, determined guy. My dad could make a decision on a heartbeat, and he saw this coming, but he also brought me up as the little man. I mean, this is what a man does. He started brainwashing me to be able to cope with watching my mom and dad, my mom crying, my dad biting his lip as I'm getting on this airplane to go to a place I don't even know what it's called. But he did that very early on. But the one thing that really clinched it, before he got me on that plane, he looked at me and said, I give you my word, I will see you again. That's all I needed.
That's all you needed. It's incredible. Incredible. And you do see him again. You see both your parents again. Somehow they track you down, find the paperwork, find out where you are. You're reunited, and you start essentially from scratch now in the United States. But now you have opportunity, and the story is an incredible American success story. It just highlights what this country does. It gives you,
Exactly.
which is opportunity, and then you get to forge your own path, and you certainly do. And I want to talk to you about reading, because the importance of reading in your life as a young kid, and you're reading the Ian Fleming, James Bond books, you're reading Tarzan, you're reading books about World War II, and you find out about something called the OSS and Wild Bill Donovan. So you're reading these books, and that's the influence of popular culture. I had it too, although my formative years were the 80s, but very similar in that this is coming from books, fiction and non. What was the importance of those books to you growing up?
Well, it's funny. Again, I believe that God puts a path in front of us, and if we have the courage to walk it, He makes it a little easier for us, no matter how hard it is. And I had on my seventh grade school teacher, Lee Robert Krenz was my English teacher, and he was an avid reader, and he infected me with that. So I was reading books, in seventh grade that most kids are not, looking at comic books, and I have three books separate from everything else that I have. And one is Wild Bill Donovan, Teddy Roosevelt, and Wyatt Earp. Those to me are my American historical heroes from those different periods, and very, very similar characters in the sense of their convictions and their courage. But yeah, reading became a passion for me. It still is. And didn't make writing the book any easier, but that I honestly believe that's why this book, I hope, is a success, because I want people to get that story. I want parents to, if their kid comes to them and says, Daddy, I want to be a CIA operations officer, they don't take him or her to therapy. Mm-hmm. That they understand that it is an honorable profession of men and women of incredible integrity, hard work, courage, and sacrifice. And, I love the military. I was special operations in the military, Air Force pararescue. I would have not gotten into the agency without that ticket. But at the end of the day, we don't get to wear jump wings and CIBs and Purple Hearts or whatever. Everybody in the agency has the same stupid blue badge, whether you are a GS6 or an SIS5. So, recognition outside of the agency is not something anybody expects.
Yeah, I think that's a draw for a lot of people as well. Operating in the shadows, you don't really know too much about it. So for some, that's the draw, as it was for you, reading these books about World War II and the OSS and thinking about what's going on. But as you're growing up, Vietnam starts to heat up. You're hearing more and more about Vietnam. You want to serve your country. You go into the Air Force pararescue, get this medical training, and then you missed Vietnam. Like, you were just at the tail end of it, and missed that right there. And I think you reach out to the agency initially, right around then, trying to get in, and they say, hey, we're not hiring anymore. Kind of like the military. Everybody's trying to figure out what to do in this post-Vietnam era. And so you continue down the pararescue path for a little bit. You become a firefighter. And then eventually, I think you're at a PJ and you work with some agency guys who call you the Cuban PJ. And they
Yeah.
remember you when they need somebody to do some paramilitary work in Central America. How did that all come about?
Well, I did apply. The first time was in 1974. And of course, this was the attrition for both the military, but definitely the agency was decimated by different, political whims. And so they sent me back a real nice letter. I told them, hey, I miss Vietnam. I want to do Air America anywhere, have gun, will travel, whatever you need, And they said, we're actually firing, not hiring. That's pretty much what they told me. I tried again. I'm 79, early 80. I tried again. And this time they called me in because they needed medics. They needed guys like pararescuemen that would work with Special Activities Division, which is our special forces or special operations forces of the agency. And that's where I met the ground branch guys and some of these folks. They were still not hiring. So I said, guys, I'm not going to lose my paramedic credentials to come over here, every 30 days and work a week. So I pulled the plug on that. But then when the Sandinistas declared themselves communists and started fomenting communism throughout Latin America as surrogates of the Cubans, surrogates of the Russian, the Soviet Union, the agency did not have a single native Spanish-speaking guy with paramilitary background. And they're going like, who was that Cuban kid? You remember the PJ? Because I was the first pararescueman they ever saw in that building. And the rest is history. I got dragged into it. And my only question to them was, is this long-term or another short-term? And when they said long-term, I said, I'm in. And they asked me, do you want to know what it is? I said, I don't care.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love this story. And then, because now we're into my formative years, Reagan has become president. Things are shifting. Obviously, there's a focus on Soviet via Cuba influence and sometimes not even via Cuba in Central South America. And you find yourselves on the front lines, essentially alone and unafraid. I mean, the things I was seeing in a newspaper and in Time Magazine and Newsweek, where I'm getting little snippets of things going on down there, and I'm already into special operations. I'm studying Vietnam. I'm reading these different works of fiction where people had backgrounds in Vietnam as either Army Special Forces or Navy SEALs or Marine snipers or CIA paramilitary people. But so I'm in this phase where I'm intently focused on what's happening in Central South America, because that's what I'm thinking. Hey, this is going to be the Vietnam for me, for my generation, because I'm 8, 9, 10 time frame. And obviously things progressed to different areas of the world after that. But you are in the thick of it. In the time when I'm reading those articles and imagining what's going on down there, studying intelligence services as a young kid, wanting to go that route into the military, into special operations, you're on the ground essentially by yourself. And you have like a Browning high power, you have a knife, you carry a grenade, which I love, by the way, because I always had one on my belt in Iraq and Afghanistan. Also, even when I took my body armor off and everything else and would go to different meetings, it was pistol, and I had that grenade. So I loved seeing that picture, by the way. You have a backup pistol, I think, on your ankle that no one knew about. And you're going to these camps. I mean, you fly into to Honduras and you go to the border and you start figuring out the lay of the land. What did they tell you before they put you on that plane? And what was your mission going in? And was it what when you landed, was it what you thought?
It was first of all, it was probably arguably my best tour. And I had nothing but great tours. But this one was very visceral. Here was the same monster that consumed my first country and my family. And now I am having an opportunity to help these people that are actually fighting it. So I was in the agency for about a week before they sent me down. I had no training other than what I had received in pararescue. And of course, my Spanish was decent enough that I could, pull off being a Honduran captain and then a major. And so I spent 3.25 years almost living in the camps. And from Monday through Friday, I slept in a jungle hammock. But when I first started, we didn't even have helicopters. There was 5 people in that program. And I was the only agency officer for the first 14 months that was allowed to set foot in the camps because, again, it was covert action. That's where the shadows comes in, we had to keep, that deniability of the American hand. That changed little by little. And then we had, 100 guys out there. But for me, it was such a rewarding thing because not only am I training these people, not only am I, giving them intelligence and they're bringing back their intelligence, but I sat every single night. I would grab a cup of coffee and I would sit with a different group of peasant fighters, freedom fighters. And I would ask them, why are you here? Not one said, I read Marx and Lenin and I disagree with everything was personal. They had burned their churches. They had stolen their cattle. They had raped their daughter. They had forced conscription of their 15-year-old son. They were all there fighting for the same thing that my dad threw me on an airplane to obtain, and that was freedom. So imagine the satisfaction for me that now I'm actually cutting off some of the tentacles of this communist octopus in a completely different area.
Yeah. I mean, it's incredible. The story is so incredible. And you can tell reading it that it's so intensely personal for you for the reasons that you just outlined. But also you're adapting down there. And there's a story, and I want people to read it because if you hadn't done this single act of kindness to one person in the camp, he wouldn't have tipped you off later that you were targeted for assassination and you might not be here today.
That is recruitment 101. And I had not had any training, but I was a street kid. I kind of knew the ropes of, hustling and being on the street. And this young man came to me a few months before. His wife was ill and he needed some money to get the right medicine. And I gave him the equivalent of $20, which back then was a lot of money to him. And he's the one that told me that because I had done a rendition on their commander, who was a real scumbag. I had actually physically forced him to come back, that they were going to try to kill me. And I've used that even in the agency as a, hey, that little guy out there that you may want to take for granted may not be the person you want to take for granted. I honestly don't think that I would have survived an attack because it was avoidance. I didn't confront them. I literally, you read it. I escaped and staged on a mountain, and we were up all night waiting for them to come and get us. But if it hadn't been for that, I would have been totally surprised because I was, for the most part, surrounded by people that I knew and trusted.
Yeah, you would have been asleep at the time, and I mean, it's an absolutely incredible story, the whole thing. But what also surprised me. I mean, there were so many amazing things in here that commander suicide and the Argentinians, like Argentina. I didn't realize that we were working through Argentina for a lot of this, and once I knew that, I could deduce that there was going to be some corruption in that system. But it actually gave me some ideas for my books kind of to weave in there. But what was the commander suicide and Argentina's role in what was going on down there?
Commander suicide, Suicida, was the only non-commissioned officer that ran a camp. And he was a wonderful friend, and he was the most loyal, brave, not a somocista, that's all, media hype. The greater majority of these guys were just there for all the right reasons. And his was my favorite camp because these guys, we would do things together. Plus we got in my first firefight in Nicaragua was arriving on this camp where we got lit up like a Christmas tree and paid back for mortars. So we won that one. But he got sideways with the Argentines, and the Argentines were there to broker. They were the first ones to help the Contras before we got involved. And but when I say help the Contras, is they facilitated a few things. There was a presence there in Tegucigalpa of probably 12 or 15 Argentines, and these were not warriors. These were not, these were part of the police that in Argentina at the time, they were the stormtroopers, like you mentioned earlier, of the 26th July movement. That kind of individual. If you were against the regime, they would knock your door down and take you, and you'd never see your father again. So that's what they bragged about. That was their call to fame, was being that kind of thuggy. So I was very, very happy when they put me in charge of keeping them straight. And eventually they got caught, badly with the malfeasance that was there, the corruption. They were a very negative part of the equation, and I'm glad that it was removed very early on. Very early on.
Yeah, I mean, the story's amazing. And then I'd read about the mosquitoes before. Is that how you say it? Mosquito. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but I'd read about them before. But you had an affinity for this group, and they ended up being great divers. And you do and of course, being a former SEAL myself, I started reading about the dive op that you guys did, or the couple dive ops that you guys did. Can you talk us about the mosquitoes and how that what they meant to you?
Yeah, it's funny because another form of reading that I love was the history of Native Americans. I always had an unknown attraction to Native Americans. I thought that there was a certain purity about their melding with nature and everything that they held dear. And so when I got to the Mesquitia, meeting these, they're Native Americans. They're Native Americans of that area, mixed with a lot of black slaves that were shipwrecked in the area during the Spanish and the English and all that other stuff. And they're autonomous. They want to be autonomous completely, and that has never worked out for them. But at the time I didn't catch on, but my fascination was also curiosity, because dealing with the Spaniards, as we call them, as they called them, of Nicaragua, there was very little culture shock for me. I spoke the language. I knew most of the customs. Yeah, there was a few words I had to learn, but for the most part, it was when I was in the Mesquita, they barely speak Spanish. There's 3 tribes: Mosquito, Sumo, and Ramo, and they have their own dialect. Many of them speak better English than they do Spanish. So for me, there was actual culture shock, and I'll never forget one of the times that after reading so many Edgar Rice Burroughs books, I'm on the base of a river, and there's a tree about 75 yards away, and I'm teaching them how to shoot fire in RPG-7, anti-tank missiles. So I put cardboard behind us so they could see what the backblast did and all this other stuff. And they're at the ridge looking down at me at the riverbed, and I fired that thing, and it hit the tree, and it splintered the tree up. And I turn around, and these guys are like this. They're dancing. They got no shirts on. They got ripped off shorts. I felt I was in Africa. It was the most exhilarating early memory of that whole thing. And they were born fighters. These guys were born fighters. I mean, there were hunters, there were trackers. That was their way of life. So converting that into guerrilla warfare, as you know better than I do, it's a great founding. It's a great founding. They became my favorite, and we did some good ops with them. Yeah.
Oh, it's so cool. Yeah, I want people to read about those dive ops, and some that went well, some that didn't. It's also so fascinating. But you also touch base. You start meeting now people in the agency that pass through. And talk about Colonel Ray. What was his influence on you?
Yeah, Colonel Ray was my first boss, and arguably the best boss I ever had. He was bigger than life physically and in her reputation. Colonel Ray jumped into Corregidor at the age of 18. Then he was a Green Beret, one of our guys in the Laotian part of the program. And he was a GS-15, our colonel equivalent. And he was just a wonderful boss. And he's the one that, from the very beginning, started grooming me and teaching me, because I had no training other than my street smarts and, of course, my pararescue stuff. And he was a wonderful man, and I'm very proud to say that I stayed in touch with him until the day he passed away.
Yeah, incredible. And then there's a great story where you meet Bill Casey, who flies down to Honduras. And I don't think you knew he was coming, because it's maybe somebody was coming, but maybe not him. And he tells you something really cool about the work that you've been doing and what you've been sending back. What was that about?
Yeah, I had no idea of anything. I was at the camps, and we were used one-time pads. That's way before your time, but that's how we communicated by radio, one-time pads. And I got a message from Colonel Ray saying, "Get your butt back to the command." And I said, "Okay." So I make it back to the command. I wasn't in the Mesquite. I was in one of the Spaniard camps. And by at that time, we were still going by truck. So literally the next day I show up smelling like, you know what, you've been there. And I walk in and Colonel Ray says, he says, I want to introduce you to our director. Now you got to understand, I was a GS-10. Okay. So you have a GS-10 that is going to meet the director of the Central Intelligence Agency and a guy like Bill Casey, which I knew of the kind of person he was because of the OSS. He was actually an OSS veteran. So, but when I walked into the room, the first character that jumped out was Dewey Claridge. And Dewey became a big mentor of mine throughout his career. And even afterwards, we were friends until the day he passed. And here he is, he's got this smart vest, his whole press, his boots are pristine, and he's got this, $2, expensive cigar in his mouth. And he's the one that introduces me to Bill Casey. And Bill Casey looked at me, and Dewey said to him, says, Mr. Director, this is Alex. That was my alias there. This is Captain Alex. He's your man at the camps. That became my moniker for the rest of the time there. And he looked at me and he said, young man, I just want to thank you because all these photographs that you're sending me, I keep them on my desk. And every time somebody tries to argue about our supporting this, I beat them over the head with them. Keep them coming. I was walking on air. You talk about pinching yourself. And then I had the honor of being his interpreter in a meeting that included the Argentines. Mm. And they were kind of making fun of him, and he ate them up for lunch. I mean, he was a brilliant old guy that I would say he is the greatest DCI that we had, a director of Central Intelligence. Bill Donovan, if he would have been a DCI, he would have been equally impressive. But I don't think there was anybody before him or after him that came even close.
Yeah, I mean, these old, World War II veteran Cold Warriors, there's something about those guys with the touch points with the OSS, and I mean, so much history and just, yeah. What about Dewey Claridge? So so you mentioned him. What was his background and what was his impact on you?
Dewey was a bigger than life individual. Dewey wore Brioni suits, and he had the handkerchief coming out of his very polished, very educated, but totally fearless, politically and physically. He took crap from nobody. Mm-hmm. And he was Bill Casey's pit bull. That's what they call him. He was Casey's pit bull. And he's the one that started our counter-terrorism center. That was his idea. In 1986, he started it from a minuscule point at that time. He started our counter-terrorism center to try to globalize the effort of terrorism. So he was brilliant, very senior, a division chief several times and that kind of stuff. But what I loved about him, he was a real person. Even with all his extravagant persona, he remembered everybody's name that mattered to him. He never backed off a fight. If you were right, he would back you. And yeah, to this day, he's one of my heroes. Yeah.
Amazing. And you mentioned how he dressed, and in the book, what I loved is you talking about, I think it was your mom that gave you this, passed on this sense of style. And then I got to the photo section of the book, and then I saw it. So I read about it earlier on, and then I got to the photos. I'm like, oh, this is what he's talking about. And you were a sharp dresser. Like that was serious. There's some amazing pictures in there.
Yeah, we are the product of our parents if we're lucky. And my dad, from my dad, I got that. I'm not as stoic as he was. I'm sorry, because I lost him a few years ago. As stoic as he was, but his strength of character and his conviction is something that I learned a lot from. My mom was the reader. My mom was the one that, even though she worked in a sweatshop, she always saved enough money so her hair could be coiffed and her nails could be done. And she wanted to make sure that I was always clean and dressing. And so that was a pretty good yin and yang balance, the diamond in the rough, kind of getting a little bit of a velvet cover on him kind of thing. And I'm very proud of that. Till this day, I can, like I said, I lived in a jungle hammock for 3.25 years, never complained because I was happy. But I've also recruited generals and diplomats all over the world at receptions wearing a tuxedo. So
Yeah. Oh, and your author photo, even your author photo, I was like, dang, this guy can dress. Like it's, I'm like, man, still to this day, it's fantastic. But you write something here about your time in Central America, and it's something I think that you probably knew from before and you brought to the agency. But you write, treat people well, but make it clear you're doing so from a position of strength. And I think that's something you brought to. You already had that. You didn't learn that down there, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up with, for most practical purposes, the wrong crowd, but the wrong crowd also has a certain ethic to it, a certain um, forging that you have to be loyal, you have to be who you say you are, you have to be credible. And when we transitioned from the Cold War never went away, guys. That's BS. The Cold War has been ongoing for all of us, nonetheless. But the attention getting part of it was terrorism. Mm. And when we shifted gears to start focusing on terrorism and counter narcotics, which again is something we helped a lot with, a lot of people don't understand that we work very closely with DEA at the strategic level, of course. It was a way of learning a new craft, because now you're not meeting diplomats, you're not meeting businessmen, you're not meeting local politicians, you're meeting people from the shady side of the business. Mm-hmm. And the advantage that I have is that I could sit across the table from one of these guys and look them in the eye, and they knew that if they bit me, I was going to bite back. I may not win, but I was going to bite them back. And this was a huge bump up for our special activities division folks, because the paramilitary type of guys, the guys who had had the military training like you yourself have, they came in with a certain grittiness that our very bright, very brave college kids had yet to learn. They could sit across the table and knew that they'd been there and done that, and they were still able to do it again. And in that world, that was very important, getting that respect up front. And not just from the terrorists or the bad guys, but a lot of the cops that you work with in military that are extremely aggressive because they're fighting for their lives. They got to understand that you're serious and you're there for them. But we're equals. We're equals in the sense of respect and conviction.
And eventually, you're spending that. You're down there. You're in these camps. Incredible story. But eventually, you get word that it's time to go to the farm, or you're offered a position to now become a case officer and go that route. Where were you when you found that out? How did you get that class update and start work at the farm, start training at the farm? And what did you take from that experience in Central America with you throughout the rest of your time in the agency?
Yeah, again, I think that our metal is forged along the way, and the Nicaraguan experience was extremely important to me. When my tour was over, like I said, I did a little over 3 years there. Colonel Ray wanted me to get home base in Special Activities Division, and he was getting a little bit of pushback. Well, yeah, let's bring him back, and he said no. So he called Dewey Claridge, and he said, Dewey, Prado is coming out. He needs this. So he picked up the phone. He called the chief of SA Special Activities Division and said, you got 2 hours to home base him, or I'm taking him to Latin America Division. So they home based me in the paramilitary side, which I was very happy with, because that was my crowd. And I needed to finish my college, so they sponsored me for a year. So I did 2 years of college in 1 year, graduated with distinction, and went into the farm. And both at the college and at the farm, I had something that a lot of the guys did not have. One of my classmates, Henry, I call him Tocayo, he was a Vietnam vet, Green Beret, shot, the whole 9 yards. And but the majority of the other young people did not understand, that grittiness of having lived with the Contras, and the same thing in college. When I was taking my night classes, the students would come out at break and say, Rick, we're so glad you're here. Because I was sparring with very liberal instructors. I went to George Mason University, and which is a good school, and I loved it. But I had a couple of teachers, and the one teacher that became my biggest supporter and actually, recommended my graduation and everything else, read my thesis, She and I never agreed on a single thing ever, because she was, left of Lenin.
Yeah.
But she appreciated my arguments. And she also appreciated that I always challenged her respectfully, and we sparred, but we sparred in a very positive way. So in both occasions, both at the college and at the farm, that historical background, even though I couldn't say that I had been in Nicaragua, but the fact that I lived in Cuba and that I had read and everything else gave me a little extra traction.
Oh, wow. So what you did was still classified. Did they know that you were coming from the paramilitary side of the house, or they just thought you were just out of college?
I was DOD
No kidding.
contractor or some BS cover. Yeah.
Wow. So you're doing out at the farm, you're doing the SDRs, you're learning about that sort of a thing. You're doing your scenarios of recruitment and all that. And you get to do they still have the, what do they call it? Crash and bang, and you're doing the driving and doing that sort of thing. So you go through the whole experience.
Yeah. The only thing that I did not go through was the paramilitary training that the regular students get, because I already had that. So guys like Henry and myself were prior service and in prior agency. We were already in the agency. We were now being professionalized. So that was a little different. But yeah, I mean, it came from the blunt object mentality to now one of finesse. And again, I think that this is where that growing up with both sides of that yin and yang in my family allowed me to dress up and work in alias and recruit highly educated senior government officials, while at the same time sitting in a back room in a safe house and reading somebody the riot act. So yeah.
Man, and you graduate and you go right back to Central America? Is that where you head?
Yeah, I was supposed to go to El Salvador. And that was my household goods. I had just gotten married in Honduras with my wife, who's Cuban, and we had met in Miami. But when our household goods were already in El Salvador, when this chief of station in Costa Rica, who had met me up in the Contra days, said, "I want Prado." So I got called into the division chief, and this happened twice in my career, where division chief calls me in and says, "Somebody wants you to go where you're not, assigned to go." And I never blinked an eye. For me, it was a little bit shocking, because the reputation of the southern front of the Contra program was heavily tainted with former Sandinistas, and there was a lot of infiltration. Costa Rica wasn't Honduras that was very supportive. On the contrary, they were actually hunting my guys down, and I had to avoid. So I went from in uniform, carrying a Carr 15 and a Browning high power and a grenade in my pocket, like you mentioned, and my backup Walther in my PPK and my ankle, to literally doing French resistance kind of stuff, that we're having meetings in vans and picking these people up covertly and try to, exfiltrate them out through maritime means so they could go and get the military training that they needed. So it was a huge contrast, but it was also another growth period. Again, now I am gone from the paramilitary to the training. Now I am in coat and tie working out of an embassy as a diplomat and doing my snooping and pooping on the side. So pretty fun.
And what is the Soviet influence like down there at the time? And was there a difference that you noticed between your time working directly with the Contras in those camps and then what you ended up doing more as a case officer?
Yeah, because again, the Southern Front was primarily former Sandinistas that had a change of mind under Comandante Cero, Eden Pastora, and but I will tell you, there's several commanders. One in particular, I call him, his nom de guerre was Ganso, the goose, and he was the best commander we had. To this day, we're friends. We stay in touch. So they had some really good people, but we also knew that they had been infiltrated by the Sandinistas, and that there was a lot of reporting. And again, the problem was the Costa Ricans were actually afraid of the Nicaraguans, and they wanted to remain neutral. Their remaining neutral meant putting our guys in jail and then throw them out and throwing them back into Nicaragua. So there was a lot of interscene stuff going on, and the communization of Costa Rica was there. There was parties that were growing, and which was great because it allowed the more conservative folks in that country to be willing to help a guy like me exfiltrate these guys through their farm or on their boat back to a safe haven where they can go and get some training. So it was a stark contrast, and we had some great successes there too.
Incredible. And where do you first hear the term, what would become known as Iran-Contra? Are you working at the time? Are you in the farm at the time?
Yeah,
Where are you when you hear
well,
that term for the first time?
I was in Costa Rica, and this was all the whole Iran Contra became a little later. But the incident that was the tipping point was when Hassan Fuss was shot down and was the only survivor on a plane, and that was a resupply flight for the FDN, the Northern Contras that were gone that far south. Okay. It wasn't a drop to my guys, but my radio operator called me out our secure phones and said on radio, and he said, "You need to come in. There's a plane down." So I went straight to the place, and they told me, he said, "This." I said, "Why didn't I know of this airdrop?" He says, "It isn't for us. It isn't for us. It's for the other. It was for another commander." So I immediately gave out the order. I said, "I want every able-bodied guy to start combing north and get this guy and bring him back. Whoever, any survivors, bring him back and protect them." Well, unfortunately, Hassan Fuss decided he wasn't going to go anywhere. He stayed right there by the wreck, pitched a hammock out of his parachute, and he had all kinds of incriminating stuff on him, phone numbers, names, all kinds of stuff that became a big deal for the Sandinistas to showcase. And that began the investigations. And subsequently, the actual Iran-Contra scandal came out. I was dragged as a GS-12 into the grand jury.
Oh, wow.
Not as a subject, but as a witness, which was kind of fun because I could, just because you ask me a question doesn't mean I have to answer it in the way that you expected. So I got to be able to tell the guys what I saw, how badly these resources were needed. Mm. And the fact that I had documented every single airdrop that we had given to our folks for resupply.
Wow. I mean, at least it's incredible touch points with history that you have over your time in uniform, or not in uniform, your time in the agency is, it's astounding. And then they send you to the Philippines. So obviously you've had all this time in Central America, this expertise, this language, the relationships. Why do they move you to the Philippines? Is it career development type of a thing, or does someone that hey, we need this guy, he's a solid operator, grab him and put him where we need him right now?
I think it was a combination. First of all, I've always been fascinated with Asia. Because of the martial arts early on, and to me, Japan and all that area there was always a mystery. But it was one of my it was the chief of ground branch at the time who called me in, and he said, "Look, we have a slot for a paramilitary officer, first in a South American country, and then the same thing happened in the Philippines. We have a spot. We need bona fide case officers who have paramilitary skills to start filling these jobs, because that's the future. We need to be real dual track. They call them dual track case officers." So for me, it was a win-win. I got to go to Asia. And again, I like growth. I like challenge. And now I'm dealing with a new culture, very different than my Latin America years. So it was very rewarding. It was very hairy. The Philippines at the time, I got there about 6 months after Colonel Nick Rowe was assassinated.
I can ask you about that.
In a very, very freak way. So, the MPA, the New People's Army, was in Manila. And of course, we had the Abu Sayyaf growing in the Mindanao area, which we tackled both. So there's in the books, there's a couple of close scrapes there where, and it taught me really early on that awareness beats fast draw anytime.
There you go. Yeah. I love how you pay tribute to Jeff Cooper and the color system that he came up with, and training and all of that in the book. So you spend your time in the Philippines. I spent a little time there myself. Fascinating place, obviously, with incredible history. But then they pick you up again, and now you're focused on Korea. Like, what is when you get picked up and you're first out of Central America. Boom. Now you're in the Philippines. Now you're out of the Philippines. Now you're focused on Korea. What is the training that they give you or that you do yourself to prepare yourself for what you're about to step into? Are there turnovers with people, or are they just out and you're in? How does that work?
Well, it was a little more complicated than that, because what happened was I was in the Philippines when the then East Asia Division chief, Jack Downing, a very dear friend and mentor, was visiting. And we're sitting at a dinner, and I'm sitting to his left, and the chief of station is telling him, Prado's doing a bang-up job. He did this and he did that, and he managed this and whatever. And Jack, I was still home based in Ground Branch. And Jack Downing looked at me. He says, when are you going to get a real job? I said, sir? He goes, yeah, when are you going to come to a real area division? I said, I don't know, sir. What do I have to do? And he looked at me, he says, you just did it. 2 days later, I was home based in East Asia Division. My time in Ground Branch had been done. I was already getting a little older. I was a GS-14. I knew that I wasn't going to be going to the camps in Nicaragua or something like that. And I wanted to follow the other kind of action. So, but I actually wasn't going to Korea. I was going to another place that I cannot mention. And I spent 14 months learning that language. And similar to what happened in Costa Rica, the chief of station in Seoul said, I want Prado. So the division chief calls me in and he says, look, this is non-binding. I know you're going to turn it down. But when the chief of station asks for something, we got to follow through. And he told me, who he was and all this other stuff. And he had a pretty rough reputation. And which I have, like you, I don't have a problem dealing with, rough reputations. That's where we're surrounded by most of the time. So I go in there and I said, well, sir, I have one question. Can you tell me what the job is all about? And he says, no. And I said, I'll take it.
I love it.
Because with my clearances, XYZ, after, if it's something you can't tell me up front, that's the kind of stuff that I want to do. And it was a very, very rewarding assignment for me. Completely different. This was international tradecraft. It was a lot of fun. And again, a lot of growth. And it got me my GS-15. I got my 15 when I left there. Which
has some other repercussions. But I love that they tell you, hey, we can't tell you what we're going to be doing. And you say, I'm in. I love it. It's
the name of the game.
So eventually here you're doing this and then you make GS-15. And there's something that has been started up a few years prior, the CTC, the Counter-Terrorism Center. And is that, what is your path then into that part of the agency?
Well, my first CTC assignment was 88 through 90 in that South American country where I literally recruited a terrorist and ran several big operations down there. So I always had an affinity for that. And I had put in to go back to CTC when I was leaving Korea. So they gave me a branch. I was the head of the Palestinian branch, which was a pretty big deal. But about 2 months into my tenure, I got called in and he was the chief of operations, which I eventually became myself 5-6 times removed. He called me in and he said, your name has been surfaced to be the deputy chief of station on a task force, special task force that's going to be called an issue station. And, are you interested? I said, of course, I'm deputy chief of station. Are you kidding? And I said, sir, who are we targeting? He said, Osama bin Laden. I said, who? And he said, exactly. Mike Scheuer was the chief. He was an analyst. So I was the senior ops officer and the deputy. And he knew all about bin Laden. And that became the passion for me for quite a while after that. And, this is as a former SEAL. Yes, the SEALs shot bin Laden, but we found him. And it was that same little nucleus that 18 years later, through sleuth hound work and a lot of digging, we're able to geolocate him and target him. And then your brethren went in there and did a hell of a good job. But that was, again, a big change for me, because now I'm dealing with not Latin American terrorism, not East Asia terrorism, like in the Philippines. I am dealing with radical Muslim kind of terrorism of what we saw in Afghanistan and in the rest of the Middle East. So yeah, it was a good ride.
And is that Alex Station when you step into that? So it's already Alex Station. And I noticed that there is quite, when you talk about those redactions you talked about earlier, there are a few around this section, especially we're talking about Billy Waugh and what he was doing down there. And I wanted to ask you about Executive Order 11905 signed by Gerald Ford and what that meant to you guys when you possibly could have removed bin Laden from the battlefield before what transpired on September 11th, 2001 eventually did.
Yeah, again, we all benefit from the 2020 hindsight. We all have that ability. But, the agency has Title 50 authorities that can include lethal findings, like after 9/11, 17 September, President Bush signed the lethal finding of going after Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So you cannot be the premier service to the most powerful country in the world and not have that capability in your toolbox. And I'm not talking about just killing people. I'm talking about being able to disrupt major, events if you have the groundwork done. So that whole era was, of course, which has led to 9/11 and everything else. But bin Laden in 1996, when we started the task force, late 95, early 96, by mid to late 96, we had made a book on him. Billy Waugh, who's just talked to him yesterday.
Oh, yeah?
One of my dear friends. He's 92 years old.
92.
8 Purple Hearts. Yep. I just talked to him yesterday. We were coming back on a car, and I had to give him a call. But Billy was literally in charge of surveillance of bad guys in Khartoum. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you've read his book, but he's
Hunting the Jackal.
He captured the Jackal. He's the one that identified, put glass on him, and triangulated him and had him coming and going, that we were able to hand him over to the French. But he was also doing bin Laden. And he used to run by bin Laden's place, say hello to the guys. And he told me one day, he says, Rick, I was so close to him one time when he was coming out in his Mercedes, driving it himself, I could have killed him with a pencil. I never forgot that, because Billy could kill you with a pencil.
Wow. Legend. Yeah. For those who don't know who Billy Waugh is, put it in the Google it, and then get his book as well. Billy Waugh. And I distinctly remember reading that book. I think I was in Iraq at the time when I read it. Maybe around 2005 or so. Anyway, whenever it came out, I read it. And I remember that him jogging and him talking about the walls. I haven't read it since then. I've only read it that one time, but that stood out to me, how close he was and how he saw this guy almost every day on his jogging rounds.
He had him coming and going. He knew, and of course, being with his background, he had evaluated the resistance, what we could get away with. And he was adamant that, look, at the very least, we could render this guy with minimum bloodshed. Mm-hmm. If we send in the right team in there, it'd be easy day. But again, the political fortitude wasn't there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
We would have avoided a lot of heartbreak and a lot of blood.
Imagine how history would be different if he'd been removed from the equation back then. I know. There's a lot of redactions in the Jihad Factory chapter. And then I wanted to ask you about Tombstone Rules. I love the title, of course, of that chapter. And then Shangri-La and your experiences there.
Yeah, Shangri-La was a radical Muslim country in Africa. And I'm not allowed to say the name, so that's why we call it Shangri-La. And we were sent there. It was strictly a counter-terrorism unit that I had put together. We had gone through one of our black sites training with guys from your generation. Steve Bailey, who was Force Master Chief for SEAL Team 3, SEAL 1, I'm sorry, is to this day one of my closest friends. So he was one. I brought him to the agency that he was training us. So we had a pretty sharp bunch of guys, former combat veterans, Rangers from Mogadishu and all this kind of stuff. And our job was trying to pinpoint where the terrorists were, because Khartoum at the time was a hotel for terrorists. Mm. If you were willing to pay the price, you had safe haven. So that's where Carlos was there. There were Hezbollah folks there. There was all kind, and of course, bin Laden, who was pumping millions and millions of dollars into the economy, building roads and terrorist camps. So we were there post bin Laden, but pretty much trying to, again, make book on some of these guys. We would intercept information, a house near this place that has a blue car in front of it. Then we go check it out, get the license plate, that kind of process. So, but that was again, this is a most 99% Black area. I had one Black officer that was in and out, but the rest were tragically white guys. But we had masks and disguises that we could pass, at least, casual. If they saw you driving down on a thin-skinned vehicle, non-diplomatic, you just looked like another African. And that's how we went into some of these really nasty neighborhoods and did geolocation for some of these guys for if in the future we're going to need them. So yeah, I had a lot of fun there.
What a run! I mean, it's just incredible everything that you did. And then, where were you on September 11th?
I was chief of ops at the Counter-Terrorism Center. I had just taken over. I had come out of Shangri-La in May of 2001, and late May of 2001. And when 9/11 happened, I was chief of ops there. And obviously, all our lives changed at that moment. And everybody knows where they were at when 9/11 happened.
Were you physically in the building, or how did you get word that something had happened?
Oh, no, I was actually in front of the office waiting for Cofer to clear and for Ben Bonk, his deputy, to come back. Like I said, I was his chief of ops. And I was talking to the secretaries, and the TV was on. And we see this plane hit the building. And at first I thought it was a Cessna or something like that. I said, that looked like a small plane. God, that's a weird accident, but and we're all fixated on the TV. And CTC at the time, the CTC creation was bringing in just about every federal agency and home basing it there. So we had DS folks, we had FBI folks, we had Secret Service folks, we had all kinds of people and we had an FAA guy in the unit. And he came out and said, Mr. Prado, we got an issue. And I say, yeah, okay, I saw the plane. He goes, no, we have 4 aircraft that are not responding to their post, call that they said we're being hijacked. And it wasn't 20 seconds later, here comes a second plane and hits the building. And I remember turning to the chief of staff that was there, and I told him and said, my first order was get a cable worldwide to everybody with 2 things. First, watch your 6. This is not an isolated event. This could be a major initiative here. And number 2, all resources go to finding out from any source that we have who could have done this, and start tracking those people. So needless to say, it was a very intense period for us. I slept there for 3 days before I ever went to go home. And we worked incredible hours. But getting back to being in the building, the building was evacuated because that other plane that was in the air that luckily through some brave individuals ended up in a dirt field. We didn't know where it was. And a lot of people were betting that, hey, look, if you really know what you're doing, you want to take out the agency, as part of, you hit the Pentagon, hit the agency. So Tenet declared complete evacuation. And Cofer came on and said, you know what? Anybody that has to go pick up their kids from school or whatever, you're free to go. Anybody that wants to go, but I'm staying. And you'd be surprised. And there's a story that I'm very fond of in the book where I had the deputy of Hezbollah, a 8-month pregnant lady, case officer, Christy, and I'm making the rounds like at 8:00 at night, and there she is at her desk with a belly out to here. And I went up to her and go, what the hell are you doing here? She says, well, I'm not sure that like everybody thinks that it's bin Laden. Hezbollah has killed more Americans than anybody else to date. And, I want to make sure that it isn't something we missed. So I told her, I said, look, I've delivered 2 babies in my life and neither one of them was mine. So you're going back home right now.
You want to make it a third?
I wasn't about to deliver a third that wasn't mine. And it's funny, later on in life, when we would cross paths, she would always tell me, says, Rick, he said, every year that my daughter has a birthday, I think of you. And the reason I have it in the book is because the strongest natural tendency is motherhood. Just mess with a mama bear that's protecting their cubs, right? And here is an 8-month pregnant lady with her only child, and she is staying in harm's way for God and country. If you can override that maternal instinct, That's conviction. That is true conviction to the mission.
It is. And then what do those next few years look like for you then until you depart the agency and then move over to Blackwater for a little bit? What are those next years? Because there's been a shift now. I mean, you're a cold warrior, Central America, you're going around the world, Philippines, Korea, a few other different places in there. And now we have this paradigm shift when it comes to international terrorism. We've been attacked on home soil. What do those next few years look like for you?
Well, as much as I love the moniker of being chief of ops of the Counter-Terrorism Center, I mean, come on, it doesn't get any sexier than that, right? So I was enjoying good visibility into ops, senior management. I was an SIS2 by then. And, but I just didn't want to be behind a desk. Mm-hmm. And I came up with a program that I actually briefed the Vice President of the United States, Dick Cheney at the time, and Condoleezza Rice, which was in a nutshell, it was a sleuth hound intelligence collection exercise with teeth at the end. Mm-hmm. My concept was during 9/11, we kept hearing all this chatter that something is going on, but we couldn't know what it was. And my point was, if we can make book on a number of targets that are those support mechanisms that are essential to a terrorist organization. And the reason I say support mechanisms is because they are reachable. They have to have a public persona in order to operate and provide the safe houses, the medical, the money, the documents, everything else that terrorists need to move about it and do their damage. So the concept was to have X number of people that we had under full surveillance. We had full patterns of life on them. And then we would come up with 3 different scenarios for disrupting them or neutralizing them. So let's say that 3 years down the road, we get wind that Hezbollah is up to something. Well, you pull out the file on the 3 Hezbollah guys, and guess what? They get disrupted one way or the other, whether it's with your guys or ours or combination. They get either kidnapped or compromised with the cops or whatever we're authorized to do. And that was briefed to the vice president. He loved the idea. He blessed it. Then became politics again, when as the distance between 9/11 to now, which was a good year later, the testosterone had dropped, the spinal calcium had also evaporated quite a bit, and politics took over again. And it was like, well, yeah, this is great, and I know you could do it, but the political ramifications are. And that's when I said, my time is done here. Wow. This is my last hurrah, and I retired out of the agency. So
okay, so it's very clear to you, hey, it is time to move on. It's been a solid run, but it's time to turn the page.
Yeah. If we're not, look, I have on my wall, I have a little thing that's a baseball and says sometimes you got to play hardball, and I'm a firm believer in that. I mean, we cannot be the agency, the intelligence agent to the U.S. government, and not have that capability in our toolbox. Yeah. We only have 2 jobs in the agency as operators: collect intelligence and do covert action. We have our analytical side, and of course we have our security and everything else, but operationally, that is what we do. And this was nothing more than a very well thought out and it's very successful in its inception to provide that capability that was, it briefed well, and I don't sit for paper tigers.
I like it. Yeah, well, you've been so generous with your time. I do want to ask you quickly about your the next phase of your life, the Blackwater phase, and what was that experience like for you?
Well, I had met Eric when I was chief of ops, because he took a team out to Kabul to provide our security for you guys. And when I say he took a team out, I don't mean he was a team leader. He was one of the nugs. So I had a lot of respect for him from the very beginning. So he pitched me to come over. I was the first agency guy to come to Blackwater. Later on, I brought, about 3-4 months later, I brought Cofer Black. He became the big talking head for Blackwater. And Eric was a wonderful guy to work with. He was extremely patriotic, extremely loyal. And he told me, he says, look, I don't know exactly what you were doing training down at Blackwater, but the stuff that you were doing was cool shit. So he says, we need to, I want to replicate some of that. So we began helping the intelligence community writ large, and that's as far as I can go. And I will tell you, it's not in the book because Fortunately for me, none of the stuff we were able to do has ever leaked. Unlike the Contra programs and all these other things that are things that they can see the light of day because they're OBE as far as tradecraft or anything else. But we did some really good work, and what I'm very proud of was that this wasn't contract. He didn't charge the government a dime on this stuff.
Wow.
Yes, he did with it this stuff in Iraq and Afghanistan and air and guns and PSDs and all that other stuff. That's where he was making his fortune. But these programs that I was initiating and subsequently running successfully, it was reimbursement only. Wow. They reimbursed me for my travel, for my pay that whatever it was. And I always thought that was really high ground for Eric. And I have a lot of respect for him. I haven't seen him in years. He's gone his own way. A lot of people ask me, well, what do you think of Eric now? I go, I'm an intelligence officer. I don't deal in gossip. All I can tell you is facts. The fact was that when I worked with him for 8 years,
wow,
he was a patriot and a friend.
Yeah.
What he's doing now, I know what other people are reading in the journals, and I don't believe half that stuff anyway. So
right, probably very wise. But yeah, I was at SEAL Team 2. We did a lot of training at Blackwater out there on that track and those ranges, and had a great time doing the driving stuff out there. That was incredible. Of course, a lot of my friends went over to work there and contract and do that sort of a thing. But I'll tell you what, one of the highlights of my time over the 20 years in uniform was a time that I got detailed over to the agency in Baghdad in 06 for the STU program. And I'm sure you know what that is. And I was the only military person attached. And I got to tell you, that was the best assignment ever, because my job was battlefield deconfliction, tactical radio as we'd move through these different battle spaces, just touching base with the QRF. So we would go hit our targets, and it had an aircraft above, a special aircraft. And it was just a highlight working with those guys. It was an honor to work with those guys, learned so much from them. Of course, we had our partner force there and all of that. But and then in my novels, it became the foundation for particularly my second novel, True Believer. But that experience has touch points with all of them, because it was such a powerful experience. And I almost went over there. It was I won't say the name of the program just in case I don't know why it would be classified. It's just a name, but similar to the one in Vietnam, where they had guys that were typically SF at the time, and then they brought them over to the agency side of the house. So I was in that program and had my little meeting with somebody in a hotel room in Northern Virginia, and then got the thumbs up from that, and then went through the whole medical and lifestyle poly and all of that, and had my class update at the farm, doing the dual track to go, of course, do the case officer stuff. But I was headed to ground branch, and then at the last second got offered an OIC position, officer in charge, platoon commander, to get back in the fight. And I just wanted to get back in the fight as soon as I possibly could. So I ended up going that route. But it was, it was essentially hours away from going, after having done all that work and going through all that whole process and having my date at the farm, the whole thing, and then ended up staying in the SEAL teams. But yeah, my experience with the agency was nothing but positive. Total professionals across the board, from analysts to the paramilitary side of the house. And I want to thank you for putting that time in for our country, sacrificing so much for our country, and then for telling the story, because people need heroes, and people need inspiration today, particularly young people who have grown up with these luxuries that we talked about before. So there are very few books that are as powerful as this, that kids can read today, high school people, college people. This is a must read. Parents, grandparents, buy it, read it, buy second copies, third copies, give it to your kids, give it to your grandkids. Can't recommend this book enough. You just did a fantastic job with it. And thank you for your service to this nation.
Thank you for yours, and thank you for having me on. Your books are very credible because of your background, and that's what I think is what differentiates novels from just people that have the background. So thank you for your service, and thank you for having me on board, because this means a lot to me to get that word for the same reasons you just stated out to the people.
Oh, I sincerely appreciate it, and if I can ever do anything for you, please reach out. I'll be standing by.
Goes both ways.
Navy Federal Credit Union. The name would suggest that it is just for members of the Navy, but that's not true. It is open to all members of the military, regardless of branch, veterans and their families. So go to NavyFederal.org, check them out. Federally insured by NCUA. They have certainly financed a few of my motorcycles over the years. I've been a member since 1996. So car loans, home loans, motorcycle loans, whatever it might be sure to check them out. And if you're just getting started and need some help investing, they can help you there too. So be sure and check out NavyFederal.org. I want to thank my friends at Black Rifle Coffee for sponsoring the Danger Close podcast. I've been a huge fan for the longest time. Drink Black Rifle Coffee every day. And if you keep your eyes peeled, you will notice that perhaps Chris Pratt is wearing a Black Rifle Coffee t-shirt, not unsimilar to this one, in the Amazon series adaptation of The Terminal List. Now you can go to blackriflecoffee.com/dangerclose and use code DangerClose20 at checkout for 20% off your purchase and your first coffee club order. Black Rifle Coffee, America's coffee. Keep crushing. Today's gear segment is sponsored by Paleo Valley, and I'm so glad that I found these guys because their products are delicious. Go to paleovalley.com, check them out. But look at this, 100% grass-fed beef, and these beef sticks right here, 1, they're delicious. 2, they're good for you. And 3, I love that it has this Best Buy date on there. So if you're like me and maybe you're stashing some in the car, in your backpack, in your desk, and you pull one out and you're like, how long has this been there? It tells you Best Buy right here. You don't have to search for it. So love these things. They are so good and 100% grass-fed and grass-finished. The beef is sourced from small domestic farms in the United States, keto-friendly, and Paleo Valley refuses to cut corners. They prioritize health over profit, and they want to bring nutrient density back to the dinner table. It's an accessible, family-owned company, and they have a passion not only for health, but environmental restoration, animal welfare. They're just a great group of people with an amazing product. So once again, paleovalley.com. Go there and enter code DangerClose15 at checkout to receive 15% off your first order. Once again, that is DangerClose15 for 15% off that order at checkout, paleovalley.com. These things are awesome. Thank you guys for making these because they are fueling my next novel. Welcome to the gear highlight portion of the Danger Close podcast. This is a special one because I got to run this SIG pistol not too long ago and absolutely loved it. So this is the SIG P210 Carry right here. And this thing, it just feels really good and has 2 8-round magazines that it comes with, night sights right here. But you can see that this is like old school and it feels really good. I think I'm gonna have to get some leather for this one. It feels like this is a pistol that lends itself to leather holster rather than Kydex. I'm just getting that feeling. But shot this the other day and it was awesome. So bam, SIG P210 Carry right here. And this might just have to end up in a future James Reese novel. SIG, thank you. Thank you for tuning in to the Danger Close podcast, an Ironclad original presented by Navy Federal Credit Union. Find out more about Ric Prado at ricprado.com. Be sure and pick up his book, Black Ops. Gift it to as many people as you can. It's an important read, especially right now. And what an amazing guy. So that was such an honor. Ric, thank you for taking the time to come on. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it and how much I appreciate your service to the nation. You can follow me at Jack Carr USA on the social channels. Officialjackcarr.com is the website. JackCarrUSA.com is the merch. In the Blood, the next novel in the James Reese saga, is coming in hot on May 17th in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook, and is available for pre-order now. If you enjoyed that conversation, be sure to leave a 5-star rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. Until the next time, take care out there. Stay safe. Be strong. Keep fighting.